About Olivia Pratt-Korbel, the 9-year-old girl that has now been named by police, who was shot to death in her own home in Merseyside. We can cross live to our Northwest correspondent, Sophie Reaper, who is outside the scene in Knotty Ash. Sophie, the police making a statement naming Olivia just over an hour ago. Have we got any more details about what happened?
Well, as you say, at 10 p.m. last night, police were called to this street here in Knotty Ash in Liverpool after reports that an unknown male had fired a gun in one of the properties here behind me. When they arrived at the scene, they found 9-year-old Olivia Pratt-Korbel with a gunshot wound to her chest. She was rushed to hospital, but sadly later died from her injuries. Now, the police have told us what they believed happened was the following. 2 men were walking along this street when they were approached by a lone person carrying a handgun. He shot at the 2 men, who then ran away. On hearing this, Olivia's mum, Cheryl, opened their front door to see what the noise was. Seeking refuge, one of the men then forced entry into the property, who was then followed by the man with the handgun. He then fired a shot which hit Cheryl in the wrist, then fired a further shot which fatally wounded Olivia. The attacker then continued his assault, firing 2 further shots which hit the man who had entered the property, and then the attacker left on foot. Now, Merseyside police have told us that a murder investigation is now underway, and here's what they had to say at the press conference a short while ago.
Good afternoon. A 9-year-old girl, who we can name today as Olivia Pratt-Korbel, has died following a shooting in Dovecot last night, Monday, the 22nd of August. And her family are absolutely devastated, inconsolable and heartbroken. I know that the murder of Olivia has rocked our communities, who are quite rightly upset and outraged that such an abhorrent crime has occurred here on the streets of Merseyside. The people of Liverpool and Merseyside are known for their compassion and pulling together in times of crisis. And I know that our communities, people are wanting to help the family in any way possible. This is not the time for anyone who knows who is responsible for this shooting to remain tight-lipped. It is time for our communities to come together with us and make Merseyside a place where the use of guns on our streets is totally unacceptable.
Now, this incident actually took place 15 years to the day to the death of Rhys Jones, who was shot dead whilst he walked home from football training in Croxteth, Liverpool. At the press conference, GBNews asked the 2 police officers whether or not crime in Liverpool has remained at the same level almost a decade and a half after the same incident. Now, they told me that firearm crimes in the region were down by 50% last year, which was the lowest ever level. However, they also said that this is no time to celebrate, given that 3 families in the last week are now grieving as a result of gun crime. One of those families, obviously, being the family of Olivia Pratt-Korbel.
Yeah, Sophie Reaper there, our Northwest correspondent, reporting on this really upsetting and tragic story. Sophie, thank you ever so much. Do keep our audience updated. Well, writer and broadcaster Charlie Peters is my guest for today's show. Charlie, I mean, when we first heard of this story last night, a little girl being shot in her own home, it was horrific. Now knowing that this family are completely unconnected to the guy carrying the handgun, chasing apparently 2 other men, one of them who forces his way into the home after the mother opens the door to see what on earth is going on. I mean, the nation, the people of Merseyside must be in absolute shock.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a harrowing criminal act, heinous and obscene, and it should shock us. It really should shock us. The concern, I think, now is that it might not, because stories like this are becoming increasingly common. Issues of gun violence around the country, and in particular children being murdered in recent times, have been very shocking. And while further details about the perpetrators of this crime haven't been released, we can assume with some degree of deductive assessment that it's likely that this is not their first criminal action barging into someone's house in a balaclava and shooting is not your first crime, generally speaking. So I think while this story is heinous and tragic, we have to look at it within the context that this is increasingly common, and this comes within the backdrop of, I think, 12 years of Tory failure to ensure that crime is given the significant amount of government attention it requires. And of course, this crime happened in Liverpool, but where we are now in London, the number of police stations that were open in 2009, 134. Now there are 35. The number of support staff that the cops had in 2010 was 21,000 more than there are today. So while we have to put the full blame on the criminals for this horrifying attack, we also need to look towards the governance and the attention that's been put towards justice in the country, which has been utterly insufficient.
Yeah, I mean, the Conservative Party, I'm sure, would argue that they have increased police spending over recent years. But, I mean, we don't know anything yet about what quite has gone on here. What we do know, residents in Nottingham are understandably very concerned about their own safety now. And this comes very quickly off the back of another young woman who was equally shot in her home. She wasn't the target of that particular crime. Connected to, I believe, who was a young woman in her 20s who worked for the council. This escalation in innocent people being shot, and especially somewhere like Liverpool as well, it suggests a real turning point, doesn't it, in the landscape of crime in this country?
Yeah, and in the last week there has been an aura of lawlessness, which I think we've seen around much of the country. In London in particular, in Oxford Street, we've seen scenes of people raiding stores for fun under the auspices of social media enjoyment and getting away with it because there's no police officers there to prevent the crime, and even if there are enough to turn up, there are hundreds of mobs to deal with. It's crazy. So, yeah, after these kind of crimes, of course, the police flood the streets around the area for a few weeks to give those reassurance patrols, that's what they're called. But over time, that dissipates, that reduces back to its normal level, and it's clear that the normal level of policing is desperately insufficient. You said, rightly that the government has increased funding in recent years for policing, especially in London, but that comes after, the best part of a decade of significant cuts. Only 10,000 police officers in the Met are frontline because they're having to do so much of this backroom work to compensate for all of the support staff and admin staff that have been cut away by the Tory government. This creates a very dangerous scenario where police officers can't be on the beat, can't be available, can't be ready and prepared to protect us. And I think that creates the circumstances for some of these horrible crimes we're seeing.
Yeah, Charlie, thank you ever so much. Honestly, the life of a little girl, 9 years old, gunned down inside her own home, a family torn apart, a community devastated, surely has to be a wake-up call. What are your views on this? Are you happy with how your neighbourhood is policed? Do you think that the UK is becoming increasingly lawless? Email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk.